Hey, good morning. Thank you for joining the Salt Lake Chamber's webinar today on Zero Trust Access 101. I'm Derek Strong, Vice President of Strong Connections and member of the Chamber's Cybersecurity Leadership Council. The dangers associated with complex enterprise design has led to the development of a new model for cybersecurity known as Zero Trust. The Zero Trust approach is primarily focused on data and service protection, but can and should be expanded to include all enterprise assets. Our panel of experts will discuss why business should adopt a zero trust architecture and why high-level government agencies are recommending it. During this webinar, we will be joined by Jeff Williams of Avast, Madinah Ali of SafePC and SafePC Solutions and SafePC Cloud. Hopefully I got that right, Madinah. And John Engates, Field CTO for Cloudflare. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's get started. Before we do that, though, if you have any questions for any of the audience members, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A function. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Salt Lake Chamber's website. So let's get started. Zero Trust. I bet you there's a lot of confusion out there by a lot of folks who, once they first heard this, well, where did this come from? Let's talk about that for a second. I'm going to throw out Executive Order 14028. Jeff, I see you laughing as soon as I said executive order.
Yeah, so I'd actually like to take a little step backwards before we get into the executive order. The executive order is super important, and it shows that the government is taking things seriously and really embracing the concepts. But I think it's helpful, at least for this audience, to think about the history a little bit more. So if we think about how networks started connecting to the internet back in the 90s, it's very different than where we are today. At that point, typically, we used a perimeter model where we either had a firewall or a DMZ with a pair of firewalls on either side. And then once you got inside of that, you had kind of the keys to the kingdom. And the analogy that I like to think of is leave it to Beaver. If we think about the Beaver Cleaver household, if somebody came over to visit the household, they would be well behaved and they would come and sit in the living room and they would have their tea and cookies, and then they would leave not having done anything. The challenge with that, if we try to apply that analogy to a network, is once somebody is inside the house, there really isn't a limit on the things that they can do if there's no constraints put in place. And so the difference between that 1990s leave it to Beaver networking model and what we have today with the threats of attack actors who have a variety of nefarious intents should they gain access to your network is that we need to have tighter controls. And so the principles of zero trust are assume breach. Don't assume that the actor that is in your home is going to do only good things. Maybe they're intending to go and look in your medicine cabinet or your jewelry box or your daughter's room or any number of things that wouldn't be something that you would have intended. So we need to move that perimeter down to the individual host. And I think that that's a fundamental change, that we're now operating from a least permissive model. So instead of giving everybody the keys to the household, we're now saying, here is the one thing that you can do. And if you try to do another thing, we're going to verify again that that's okay. So it's no longer an open trust model. It's a verify explicitly.
Just to chime in on that, I sort of think about the corporate network, which used to be the trusted network. We used to think we would come to the office and jump on the enterprise network, and that was a trustworthy environment, and everything outside was untrusted, right? If you went to the airport or the Starbucks or something else, you were sort of on an untrusted network, and you had a heightened sense of awareness that there could be threats. Well, Jeff said it. I mean, the threats could be inside already. They could have already made their way into your network from the outside. They could potentially be bad actors. If you're in a large enough company, sometimes it's hard to know, contractors coming and going or people coming and going, and you don't know who's really there, and you need to control access to resources. And, at the center of all of that is identity. Who is the person and how do we authenticate them and how do we guarantee that who's on the other end? A lot of folks are now working remotely. So the perimeter also exploded outward. We don't necessarily have this internal trusted network where PCs are connected to a physical network anymore. It's now a virtually, remotely, sort of orchestrated network that's far flung and people are traveling and you don't really know where they're coming from. And again, who's on the other end of that? And so we need better tools. And that's what this evolution of zero trust is all about, is figuring out a strategy and a sort of a model for security in a modern world where we don't have that physical or network perimeter anymore. We have a much more diverse set of resources and data, and things are living in clouds and they're on the internet now. All of that has played a role in sort of this push toward a zero trust network access model.
The work from anywhere scenario really adds tremendous complexity to this, because at this point, the perimeter is now the individual host. And if I'm working from home or I'm working from a coffee shop or whatever, there are other people on the network who are running machines that aren't managed by my enterprise. And what can those machines do to the network traffic? Can they intercept? Can they interject? There's all kinds of problems. Even in a case where somebody doesn't have hostile intent, they might be infected with something that then tries to infect you, or there might be man in the middle trying to sniff credentials so that an attacker could take other actions. So the complexity has gone up very, very much, and moving that perimeter from the outside of the network to the individual host is a dramatic shift, but a positive one.
Okay, Madinah, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I just want to interject that the reason why zero trust is at the forefront is that we are living in a new normal, and that is based on the work from home model, period. A lot of people, some people are coming into the office, but the majority of the people are going to continue to work from home. So you really need to know about every employee, all of their devices. And what we have been implementing, and what I want a lot of your chamber members to understand, is that implementing multi-factor authentication is one component of protecting the network. But there's also policies that are very important, particularly regarding bring your own device, BYOD. It is important, as we monitor these networks, we know every device. If it belongs to the corporation, if it does not belong to the corporation. And where are the vulnerabilities? Where do they lay within the network? And also training of the staff. We know now email phishing is the #1 biggest threat to cybersecurity. So the things that we have adapted, and we call it zero trust policy, the new normal in cybersecurity, is strong authentication, multi-factor authentication. Securing the networks is one aspect. But the other aspect is making sure you understand where that device is, who that employee is, who has that device, and make sure that employee is properly trained. Because the risks are greater and they keep getting greater. We're still in a pandemic. Now we're in war. And, well, we're not in war, but there's a war going on. And the reality is that hackers, this is the new way to gain access to money versus the older way of, robbing a bank. So the whole trajectory of IT security has changed over the past year and will continue if we do not educate our staff, and also as business owners become more sophisticated in how we protect our network, how do we protect our data, how do we protect our enterprise assets.
Madinah, you bring up a great point about training the employees. What would be the first thing I'm going to ask this for everybody. What would be the first thing you would train them on?
Well, the first thing I want to train them on is making sure they understand we're in a new normal. And also reviewing that BYOD policy, bring your own device policy. That has consumed us for the last 2 years. So many companies have them, but have not really implemented it. They haven't really trained the staff. Staff, a lot of times, are responding to emails on their mobile phones, thinking that the email is coming from their manager and it's coming from a hacker, really showing them what an email phishing attack looks like and really breaking it down. And one of the things that we do, because we also do the compliance regarding the NIST and CMMC framework. And one of the things, the first thing that we do is we call it workforce engagement. And around workforce engagement is start training your staff to understand how they can be vulnerable and the potential attacks just going through email phishing, and making sure they're logging in. You have the username and passwords for their normal login, but also we've been implementing a lot of the VMware, the virtualization, to make sure they log into that very secure corporate network and making sure that things are continued monitored. But you have to get your workforce, your staff engaged so they can be a part of the solution and not the problem. Because the reality is this: they do not want to come back into the office. They realize that, hey, you know what? I can do a lot and be more productive working from home. So, it is important that we educate and we keep these environments secure so people can continue to work from home, continue to be productive, and continue to find a sense of balance in our new normal. Now, you are going to have some people that are going to go into the office and they're going to feel a lot more productive. That's fine. But as John mentioned, the corporate network, we've always felt that was a lot more secure. And we didn't have to do all these extra things and, set all these additional security features. But now we have to, because things have changed so dramatically.
And with that change and the introduction of new layers of security technologies to protect, my company is a security company. We make antivirus software, we make VPNs, we have identity. And so the people here at Avast are already very security savvy. And there's many domains of security, and each person in the company is going to be an expert in one or more of those domains, but maybe not all of them. And so the important thing for us is, as we introduce these changes, we need to explain why. And giving the context of what this change accomplishes not only helps them understand that the threat landscape has changed and that the network has to evolve to address those changes, but also what role they play in that change. The last thing we would want to do is put these technologies in place and have it impact productivity to a point where people try to avoid the security controls that we're putting in place. There needs to be an understanding across the entire company of why those changes there, what the risk appetite for the company is, and how this plays into a change in addressing that appetite.
Yeah, I would just add that, even the most sophisticated user can be tricked. Even the most well-trained individual can be tricked. What I like to also think about are technical capabilities that sort of augment the security posture of the company, not just not really just berating the user for accidentally clicking an email, but putting in some technical capabilities to prevent the spread of malware should somebody click the wrong email. So when I like to think about zero trust, it's sort of like putting this sort of virtual straitjacket around an individual that they don't even know they're wearing. It's basically preventing them and preventing their devices and preventing things from happening that are bad, but not restricting them from access to the right data at the right time. We want to make the customer experience, the employee experience, as good as possible. It has to come first. We can't put barriers and friction in place that make their job harder, because inevitably employees will figure out how to go around those things. I remember the old days of the VPN. Everybody knows the VPN. We've had them inside of enterprises for years. Most companies are well aware. It was the way you got inside the perimeter when you were a remote user. Well, the VPN oftentimes required a username and a password and a second factor authentication key that you had to type in off of some credential. And it was painful to get on. And then oftentimes certain applications were available on the VPN and others weren't. And so people would avoid using the VPN. They would try to get their job done without sort of going through that process. And that defeats the purpose. So I think another aspect of Zero Trust is putting in place some new modern capabilities to make it seamless. So you can work on your laptop or your devices. You can have a secure tunnel to the appropriate resources without firing up the VPN, and really give people a way to work productively from anywhere with again, as minimal friction as possible.
Yeah, and this is particularly true with the proliferation of cloud-based services like G Suite and Salesforce and Slack and so on, where people can connect to these things outside of a VPN managed connection. And the real challenge is, if people aren't going through that VPN tunnel, any security inspection that you have that's part of your corporate network, you don't get the benefit of that. And so giving them the guardrails that John was mentioning, so that they can continue to do their job, but do it within the constraints that support your security policies, absolutely essential.
Excellent. So we talked about, one thing I realized is I mentioned the Executive Order 14028. I didn't give it a title for that for those who don't know, who are watching. It is the improving the nation's cybersecurity. One of the things that they talk about in the executive order that Jeff has hit on is cloud-based technology. The question I want to ask everyone is, specifically with cloud-based technologies, has that, or the institution of clients coming in and wanting that type of service, has that has Zero Trust changed your approach on how to articulate that to a client?
Well, let me jump in there, because I'd like to say just one quick thing about the executive order. If we think about what security practitioners have told people are best practices for the last 20 years, nothing has really changed. It's stay up to date on security updates, and make sure you've got strong passwords and multi-factor authentication, and back up your systems and so on. These are all things you should do. And what I really like about the executive order is it's taking it from a should to a must. So now for government agencies, you must do these things. And what CISA is coming out with, here are the vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild. You must patch these by this date. That's a fundamental change for government, where instead of allowing for individual departments to interpret what the best practices are and how they adhere to them, now they have prescriptive guidance on what they must do. And I think, going back to the cloud question, I think that that's the same sort of thing. We've had an evolution in the landscape, and now we all have to take these shoulds and move them to the must column, and look at, okay, we have adversaries out there who are active and, capable, and looking at not just your network, but everybody's networks. And so what must we do to protect against those? And if the vendor's defaults don't provide that heightened level of assurance because they are leaving open for interpretation of how best to implement this in your environment, that doesn't mean that you don't have to do those minimum bars of security controls to protect your environment.
And Derek, to answer your question, yes. Every client that we've had to go back to them and say, we're recommending that you must implement zero trust policy. And this is why. And a part of our approach has been policy based. And John makes a good point, making sure things are accessible for the employees, the resources, making sure that it's user friendly, making sure they feel comfortable. When we say our training is about workforce engagement, empower the employee, because remember, they want to work from home. They want to have better quality of life. So you want to provide acceptable policies and resources and tools and training so they understand, again, why they can't open up the email. But if they do open it, there are tools in place to make sure it's not spread any further, that there's no malware, that it doesn't go into the network. We are installing nodes to monitor proactively to see if the hacker will come in. And, a lot of times they sit there for 30 days, 30, 45 days to really understand the network. And a couple of times we've already caught them before they tried any vulnerabilities because we put that node in place. So yes, and the other thing, if they don't want to, implement this, we're asking them to sign disclosure statements that we did review this with you. We did explain this to you. We're working on a webinar right now with Microsoft that's going to talk about the importance of E5 and security and threat intelligence. So working on blogs, white papers, really trying to educate the consumer about the new normal. And also being very selective in who we decide to service, because this is a reality that the hybrid workforce is here to stay. And we have to look at things very differently. And just so you all know, zero trust has been around since 2010. It was actually Forrester that came out with the name. And, for the last 12 years, people did not take it seriously. And it was really the pandemic that really forced the discussion. And now, as you said, the executive order. And as Jeff said, now it's not about doing it. It's you must do it, or you run the risk of being hacked.
And not just being hacked. I mean, the must is now applying to insurance providers. So those providing insurance are now saying, it's our expectation that you will be at this minimum bar or we won't insure you. So that's getting attention of boards, and it's changing the conversation to one that's more financial in nature, and bringing in additional people to the conversation who may not have been in the, here's a security best practice discussion. Let's go implement those security best practice. Now it's we've got a corporate risk aspect that's got the attention of the board, and we're not able to get insurance because we're not doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, CISO, go do X, Y, and Z because we're now mandating this from the board level.
Interesting. You bring up a really good aspect that I think we should probably touch on a little bit. Let's talk about the financial aspect. Why is it worth for business leaders to start spending money on cybersecurity?
This is
one of the biggest changes for culture that we have, right?
For sure. So I sit on a board of a company, a large company that it is really now a strategic conversation at the board level, at the CEO level, cybersecurity specifically, because oftentimes these cybersecurity events can be very costly, not only just from out of pocket costs, but also damage to the brand, damage to the trust of the customer base in terms of, do you have my best interest, here at heart in terms of protecting my data? Oftentimes companies will hold a lot of personal information about their customers, and potentially it's not just customers, it's potentially, family members, depending on the type of organization you're dealing with. And that risk is sort of one of those life-ending events for a business if they don't handle it appropriately. We've seen lots of issues where people tried to sweep cyber events under the rug and then they get outed, weeks or months later. That's one aspect of this, but ultimately you want to prevent that in the first place. You want to prevent these cyber events. And the sophistication of the attackers has grown immensely over the last few years. And so therefore, it has risen the profile of these conversations to, again, board level, CEO level, strategic conversations. Because if you were to, for example, want to sell your company, maybe you're thinking about a M&A transaction of some sort, either buying a company or selling a company. Imagine if the cyber event happens at just the worst possible time, where your whole company is on the front page of the newspaper. Could be national papers, could be local papers, but nonetheless, that diminishes the value of your company immensely overnight. Basically, people lose trust, lose faith, and the value drops. And so that kind of conversation is certainly driving an investment down in the broader organization. It has to. It must. We must have a conversation and bring the chief information security officer up to a more strategic level, because it's not his or her job to handle this all on their own. It's the whole organization, and we have to distribute some of that responsibility across the organization. And, again, the sophistication of the attackers has grown so great. It's so inexpensive for them to launch an attack at you. There's no repercussions for someone on the other side of the world. And so there really is just this constant threat landscape that we live in, and that is part of the new normal. It's really the risk has grown just so immensely.
Yeah, and just to extend what John is saying and put some actual numbers to that, when Yahoo was being acquired by Verizon and had their breach during that M&A process, it caused Verizon to reprice the acquisition and lower the amount by over $100 million. So it's not small consideration when you're talking about an M&A scenario. It's always been a challenge to talk about the return on security investment, because how do you put a dollar amount to something that hasn't happened? But what you can do is you can talk about the potential harm. So a metric that we use in my company is potential harm of security incident. If we didn't do this thing, what's the worst thing that could happen? And what are the costs in the categories that John mentioned? Reputation and cleanup and regulatory and all of those different pieces. And would you have somebody in your organization who has a $10,000 signing authority say, I'm not going to do the work to fix this problem that could have a $10 million impact? That doesn't make business sense. And so this kind of measurement and looking at the potential harm is a way to change the conversation from these nebulous terms that are unformed, ambiguous, and hard to prove, into something that's financial and a language that, regardless of which business unit in the company it is, it's a common language that people can get around. And you may not agree exactly on the potential harm level, but it does change the way that you have the conversation.
Madinah, did you have anything you wanted to add as a CEO?
Well, I want to talk about the insurance that Jeff had brought up, which is a very good point. We are now, that's something that we are making sure our clients have, but around the cyber policies. But what we are noticing, and I think this is such a good point, is that if there's not certain parameters or controls in place, you're not able to even get the proper insurance. Because I had a meeting just yesterday with one of the largest reinsurers in the country. And they had mentioned that they're even looking at not insuring certain MSPs because they're concerned. And when we say in MSPs, managed service providers, and also certain industries, because they've already spent so much on ransomware. And if we don't get certain companies to go in and do audits to make sure this is done and this is properly being done, they're reassessing how they're going to ensure, and a lot of it is because these networks are not as secure. And can zero trust policy be a way to go? And I was explaining, yes, it can be, but again, it has to be implemented, and you must have someone coming in there auditing, a third party auditing, to make sure they are doing what they say they're doing. So this is a very important discussion when it comes to the financial aspect, because as a business, if you can't get properly insured, or if you're hacked, there's a possibility you could be out of business just from a simple ransomware demand.
So you bring up an interesting point that I want to kind of go down a little bit too, is you're talking ransomware and the types of attacks. Zero trust, implementation of zero trust, how would it affect then an incident response?
So that's a pretty broad question, but I'll talk about ransomware first. I mean, one of the things that is really a benefit of zero trust is the prevention of lateral movement. So if we think about an attack where the goal is to infect with ransomware, there are stages before that infection happens where they gain access to the network and they elevate privileges and they find the hosts that they could use to spread the malware. Well, with zero trust, if we're changing things so that every use of privilege is validated and verified, we can stop some of those attacks earlier in the chain, and in doing so, prevent the utter impact of ransomware across the environment. So that's a pretty big positive right there.
Yeah, I think I want to chime in on that, because prevention is really, you have to stop it earlier in the process. Whatever you can do to prevent them from making their way into your network and figuring out, again, where the assets are. One of the core foundational elements of our zero trust platform is DNS. Everybody knows DNS is the service that converts names into IP addresses and vice versa. But if you can, for example, filter DNS of known malware sites, places that are known to harbor malware, or places that are known for the download sites for malware, sometimes clicking that link in the email goes nowhere, because if you filtered it before the user or before they infect you, then they have no vector of attack. They have no way into your network. And then we call it sort of the blast radius. If you can minimize the blast radius, if they should attack, how can we prevent them from moving across the network? That's what lateral movement means, moving across to other services or other applications or infecting other devices on the network. And zero trust, again, it's like bubble wrap around the user. It prevents them from having the ability to do any serious damage to the things around them, because we're putting such tight constraints around the access controls. Certain applications may be completely inaccessible. They may not even be visible on the network because of the way zero trust networking is implemented. You may not see, for example, when I was talking about the VPN earlier, VPN used to give you remote access to the network as if you were on the network, which meant that once you were on the network, you could oftentimes do scanning for other vulnerable systems on the network. Well, we want to prevent that. And so the modern form of a VPN is zero trust access. And we really cut off all those vectors of probing and attacking and trying to look for other things to exploit, because usually it's not the first user that's the problem. It's what they do after they infect the first user and where they can go across the network. And that's how we limit the damage, and that's how we limit the blast radius, so to speak.
And it's not just the bubble wrap around the end user, it's bubble wrap around the attacker. If an attacker can get a foothold in your environment, they still don't have the tools that they want to download to do the attack. Well, the filtering that John mentioned, if we've got malicious sites being filtered out and not being able to be resolved, well, perhaps the attacker can't even go to the site where they wanted to pull their tools down, so that they can bring those tools into your environment and take that next stage of the attack. So there are benefits beyond just the authentication of the good users and validating their actions. In a case where you have missed a spot and the bad guy can get into the environment, it's limiting what they can do once they're there.
Another reminder you sort of reminded me of is the fact that when a user plants a malware application on a device, they are really sometimes impersonating a real user. They look like a real user from the perspective of the network or from other applications. So it's not, when we say zero trust, sometimes the user perks up and says, what does that mean? It means you don't trust me? Well, no, I trust you. I just don't trust what's going on necessarily around you and what could be done with impersonating you. You know, if someone was able to impersonate me inside of my company, that could be bad because they are not going to do the things that I would do. They're going to do things that are, again, probing and downloading data, exfiltrating data from, you know, the company and trying to harvest other user credentials and things that, you know, that I wouldn't want. So I have to stop myself from becoming a threat to the company. And zero trust, again, puts some controls around me that allow me to operate safely. But if somebody was impersonating me by taking over my device or my laptop, I need to prevent that. So I'll just give you one example of that. So for example, my machine has a device that requires me, I'm going to show you a little picture here. It requires me to touch this little credential. This is called a YubiKey, and there's a little touch point on here. And so if somebody was to take over remote access of my laptop, they really can't do much without physically being present because this is not a phishable form of multi-factor authentication. It's basically a more secure way to authenticate people. So physically, I have to be present here in front of my machine to access many of the applications in my organization that are sensitive or host sensitive information. So that's another element of this, is how do we prevent the user from doing some damage that they don't even know they're doing.
John, you bring up, you mentioned something that just kind of sparked off the top of my head, a question I want to ask everyone is, you mentioned that, protecting, you have different applications for the organization. One thing we're noticing is that the challenge that a lot of organizations have, the clients that we bring on, is that they don't do a good job at scoping out what is the important data within their business and then protecting it. Right? Madinah, you referenced the CMMC. For those out there, that's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program for the Department of Defense. And this is a big thing there as well, is scoping the critical information. So let's talk a little bit about how organizations, what's the best approach for doing that?
Every organization has different data depending on the kind of organization they are. They're going to have different data in different locations. Sometimes that data sits in self-hosted infrastructure on premises. Sometimes it sits in cloud services. One of the other aspects of zero trust is it centralizes identity and centralizes policy. So it starts to give you ways to enforce access or deny access to certain data. But you do have to take a risk-based approach. Where do you want to put the controls first? Where are your, sort of crown jewels in the organization? What do you need to protect? Every company's different. A bank is certainly highly regulated versus a retailer, but a retailer may be collecting credit cards, or they may not be. They may have a third party doing the credit card processing. So every company has to sort of take an approach to security and not try to mimic exactly what the standard says. You want to take an approach and filter it through your own organization, through your own application portfolio, and try to understand your risk profile, and then target your controls and your compensating technology against those different types of technology.
And a foundational consideration there is understanding what you have. What have I collected? Where do I store it? Who do I give access to? Under what circumstances do I give that access? What is their job function for which they need access to that portion of the data, and so on? And making sure that you don't allow, replicas of the data to proliferate through your environment because people are taking a dump and moving it into a spreadsheet for sales enablement or other purposes, and moving it to a mobile device where you don't have the same kind of visibility. So it's understanding what you have, and then making sure that the policies that you put in place and the controls that you put in place aligned to what should be appropriate use and monitoring for aberrations from that.
And Derek, that's a very good question because with CMMC, the first step that we're focusing on right now with one of our clients, well, really we're focusing on the NIST framework, which of course is based on the capability, the cybersecurity.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in there. So people, if they're not familiar with NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Yes, right. I'm sorry, National Institute Standards of Technology. I know we have so many acronyms in this world of IT. I feel like sometimes we're in our own world.
Sometimes we're sounds like we're reading an eye chart.
Exactly. But the first huge phase of that is the data backup plan. And a part of the data backup plan is the data backup strategy. And first of all, making sure you as an organization understand where that centralized critical data is in the data backup plan. But also, as I piggyback off on what John and Jeff said, making sure the employees are not backing up data in a mobile device, because that goes against the whole NIST framework. And we all know that them putting it in a mobile, and I'm even talking about an iPad, I'm talking about a tablet. It should be backed up through the SharePoint on the laptop or whatever corporate data backup tool or solution that they're using. And this is how it needs to be done. And again, make it very easy. And so, and make it seamless, so it's not difficult. So a part of the data backup plan is making sure you know what is the critical data, you know where it is, but also how does the organization work in a hybrid model on how they're backing up the data. And a lot of times what we're implementing is more automated backups. You know, once we understand what that employee is doing and understand where they are, just backing it up automatically and making sure they're not doing it from a mobile phone or from iPad, that they're, and the other thing too, we're very nice. We say, you know, we don't want you to violate the policy. Make sure you back it up from your laptop because we know you want to continue to work from home. Oh, yeah, I definitely do. Okay, so I'll back it up from my laptop. So when we say workforce engagement, it's really to engage the workforce and make them feel empowered. We don't want them to feel like, oh gosh, we're going to this extreme policy. We're changing things. We're changing things better for the organization, better for the company, better for you, better for quality of life. So our organization stays secure and you can go work out there at the lake. If you want to be in the mountains or if you want to go to the ski resort this week, you have that type of flexibility. Yeah. So though that's what's important, I think, in terms of engagement. You want to approach it like this is a win-win for all of us.
Yeah, Madinah, you're exactly right. I mean, we as practitioners have to make it easy for people to do the right thing. You know, everybody is going to try to do their job, and so you never want to get in the way of them doing their job in an effective and productive manner. But there are ways to do your job that support security and ways to do your job that don't. And you want to make it easiest to do it the way that supports security. So when we think about cloud services, you know, if a device is internet enabled, well, let's get that zero trust wrapper around the session and around the data that's going on there so that we can have that identity check and we can have those additional inspection controls and filtering controls and so on, so that people can do what they want from whichever device they're on in whatever location they're at, but at the same time preserve and enhance the security of the transaction.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, John?
Well, I was thinking about just the last 2 years and how many of the cloud-based tools have really risen to the forefront in terms of how we interact and how we operate. I mean, we're using Zoom right now, and I use Google, Drive and Google Docs for my notes. And, things have changed to the point where a lot of the critical data does live in the cloud. And so now we really have to think about how we sometimes backup is native to the cloud. Sometimes the data is already sort of taken care of, but certainly we need to protect access to those. And I think, really the scope of this conversation originally was really around zero trust access. I want to make sure no user gets access to the wrong data. I want to make sure every user has the right level of access when they need it, how they need it, that it's very fluid, that you're not having to enter multiple credentials for different sites. That I want to authenticate that you are who you say you are and that you have the rights to go to the right application. And then I want to get out of the way. I want to make it as easy for you, but I want to secure it and make it safe and make it something where you can trust that the network is secure, the device is sort of wrapped in bubble wrap in a way that prevents, sort of that third party from taking over and causing damage, and just minimize the overall risk for the organization through a number of different dimensions. And that's where zero trust, it's not a product. It's really a model for security. It's not something you buy. You don't really go out and buy a zero trust. That doesn't exist. But it's implementing things through the lens of zero trust. It's implementing technical capabilities through that framework. And I would urge everybody to educate yourself on what zero trust means. Go read a few articles. Don't just pick a vendor and assume that they've got zero trust covered. I mean, do your research and pay attention to the news. And when you hear the word zero trust, read a little bit deeper and understand what it means and what it could mean for your organization. No matter if you're a small entity or a giant Fortune 500, it really does apply, and it can be really easy to implement. So I would urge you to at least take that first step and go investigate it.
Yeah. And if you haven't implemented it in your organization already, start with those foundational principles and sit down with your key stakeholders and say, what would it mean to operate from a least permissive model? That systems can only connect to the things that they should connect to, that you can only access the data that you should have access to. And what does that mean? And what would have to change in order to accomplish that? That kind of foundational look at your environment is going to inform, what technologies you'd want to be looking at even before you start looking at vendor selection.
Well, there's one last topic I want to cover. We've talked about how zero trust helps with our employees inadvertently accessing information. In fact, we had a comment here in the chat. That's what brought it up, is that we make it easier for users to do the right thing rather than often inadvertently do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. The key phrase inadvertent kind of triggers me to talk about that insider threat. So we've been talking about inadvertent. Let's talk about the advert, people who are malicious within the company. Somebody who, for whatever reason, has an employee that decides that they have a grudge against your company. How does zero trust then really help against those type of threats?
It's a good question. I think, again, minimizing the access of an individual to exactly what they need to have access to, nothing more. Again, I talked about the idea of a malicious user on the network having sort of unrestricted access means they can move laterally across the network. I mean, even we like to think that the bad guys are out there somewhere on the internet and they're hacking into our systems, but sometimes it's as easy as coming on site as a contractor or as a repair person or whatever it might be. And, they could put a little device on your network that would be in a closet somewhere that you'd never know was there. And that device could collect data on your network, and it could transmit that data via 4G connection out of the network. I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated attack, but if you're in the critical infrastructure space, running a pipeline or an electrical grid, those are very real threats that you have to, counter. And again, I think the idea of zero trust in that context is hide everything on the network such that it's behind some sort of control, either a tunnel that you have to hop through, secure tunnel, or a credentialed access level that device won't have. If we encrypt data across the network, all it's seeing is a stream of encrypted packets, it's not really capturing usernames or passwords. And so the more we can encrypt them at rest or in transit, the more secure we're going to be. And most zero trust implementations today use a lot of encryption. They use a lot of tunnels. They make sure that data isn't running across the network unencrypted. And I think that could be part of it as well. But just minimizing what those users have access to. I would imagine that if you have a contractor working for you, they may only need access to one or two key applications. Maybe it's a customer service application. So why give them the keys to everything if you can lock down or constrain them to just a very few applications, and then implement data exfiltration, sort of this idea that we're going to detect when data starts leaving the organization. There are tools out there for that as well. So even in the context of a single application, we don't want that user to be going in and harvesting customer accounts or user accounts or whatever it might be. We want detection mechanisms to find out that user might be doing something anomalous, something that isn't normal for that user role. And so those are the kind of compensating controls that I would think about. I'm sure others have other ideas as well.
Absolutely. And having those encrypted channels and having the knowledge of what is normal enables your security operations team to identify the aberrations from that. One of the things that we're seeing with some of the modern attacks, like the Lapsus group who hit Arcta, is that they are paying insiders to take an action on the network. So somebody who already has legitimate credentials on the network, they're paying them to do something that would not be normal. So they have the rights to do things on the network, but if it's not normal, then your security operations team can come into play and you say, okay, that installation of a piece of software that we've never seen before, that shouldn't happen. Let's go investigate that. And by understanding your network at the level required in order to implement a zero trust network architecture, you've got a lot more capability to identify aberrations. You know what's normal, so abnormal stands out a little bit more.
What's crazy is that Lapsus is teenagers. There's a group of folks. I mean, we think it is. I don't. It's not 100% sure, but they've attributed some of it to some folks that are pretty young. Yeah. I also worry about the very sophisticated nation state actors who, you might have someone on your payroll, but that person might be on some government's payroll as well. And so they may have those folks embedded in organizations waiting for appropriate time to pull the lever and have them, start to collect data or use that data against you. And I think that's when we think about our government's approach to zero trust, thinking, more broadly about implementing this, they're really trying, they have a statement that goes something like, cybersecurity is national security. And basically we're protecting our critical assets in the United States, really anywhere, protecting our assets anywhere. It makes our country stronger. And so we have to really think holistically about this, because every one of us has something that other people rely on. You might not be running the power grid or an oil refinery or something like that, but you might, be running a bank, and financial services is very much critical infrastructure in the modern day. And we have to take that very seriously. And, there may be folks embedded that don't have the best intentions, and we have to protect against that as well.
And just to kind of, reiterate what both John and Jeff said, you have to limit user access. You have to have encrypted data. We didn't get a chance to really go into, I know we talked about multi-factor authentication. We talked about the policies and the trainings, but a part of zero trust is microsegmentation, which is the way to create secure zones in data centers and cloud deployments. That's very important. And then using automation to detect anything that just looks abnormal. So there's been a lot of advancement in cloud, but a part of the good thing about cloud that's come out is the cloud intelligence around AI, artificial intelligence, and really looking at abnormal behavior on a network, which could be by a user. And so that is also a part of the zero trust policy, the framework, or even a lot further when you get into the zero trust architecture. So I just wanted to make sure we talked about those points as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Madinah. I want to thank everybody. We're at that time. We're going to open it up to see if there's any questions out there from any of our viewers. We haven't had any thus far. So let's, I'm trying to think if there's any questions that I would have for our panels, any additional questions while we wait for any of these questions to filter in. Well, let's just do some final thoughts. And if any questions pop in, I'll interject. Let's start with Jeff.
I knew you were going to put me on the spot there. So zero trust is potentially boiling the ocean. It's basically re-examining your entire network end to end and changing fundamental paradigms. But it doesn't have to be hard. There are simple things that you can do. There are vendors out there who have good solutions in this space. I don't want to do product pitch. We have Avast Business, which helps this. Cloudflare has, their services. Zscaler has their service. I mean, there are a ton out there, and really, the most important thing is trying to get to those fundamental principles of validating anything that happens on your network instead of just blindly trusting once somebody authenticates, of looking at, if there was an attacker in the environment, and let's assume at all times that there is, how do we stop them from moving from system A to system B? What do we need to put in place for that? And you do have to re-examine everything that's come before. We build up our networks over time. They were not necessarily designed with cloud in mind. They were not necessarily designed even with the internet in mind, for some of us who go way back. But at the same time, that's the world we live in, and that's the world the threat actors live in. And so if you're not taking an active approach to minimizing what a threat actor can do, and zero trust is a great way to do that, then you're leaving yourself open to these negative outcomes like ransomware and breaches and all kinds of things that there are solutions for. That don't allow yourself to be stagnant. Move forward and stay up with the times.
So you said that there's solutions. We actually have a question that came in. It says, how long would it take to implement a zero trust network in a medium-sized business?
So this is one of those, it depends. So I can tell you that the work that we've done at Avast, we're a company of about 2,000 employees and another 1,000 contractors on top of that. And we've done the work that we've done is about 18 months worth of work in order to implement, zero trust networking and privileged access management, and build out our SOC capability and have detections tied to, MITRE's ATT and CK model. So there's a lot of things that go into it, and you've got to have dedicated resources for it, or bring in outside resources for it. But there are simpler things that you can do. I mean, even moving your permissioning model and your onboarding and offboarding and role change model to something that is role-based access rather than broad grants of permissioning. So you don't have to boil the ocean all at once. You can do it a bucket at a time.
Yeah, that's what I'd say is basically you can carve this apart into, phases. I mean, you can do something as minimal as, adding the filtered DNS that I talked about. That could be done pretty much immediately. I mean, that's literally something most organizations could accomplish in just a few days. They could potentially replace that legacy VPN with a more secure form that starts to prevent that lateral movement. Browser isolation is another technology that's really easy to implement if you want to force untrusted websites to be sort of browsed externally. I mean, I know that's a topic we just introduced, but it's basically taking the threats off of your machine and putting them into the cloud and allowing them to be inspected elsewhere. That's another technology that's pretty clever and prevents a lot of malware. Lots of easy things you can do, and you can do it in chunks and phases, but I encourage people to get started somewhere and at least take that first step.
I see Jeff had his hand up, but unfortunately...
No, that was an accident.
Oh, okay. Unfortunately, that's all right, Madinah. We don't have time to let you answer that question either at this point. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our discussions. I want to thank Madinah Ali, President and CEO of SafePC Solutions, Jeff Williams, Global Head of Security at Avast, and John Engates, Field CTO at Cloudflare. So everyone, thank you for this great discussion on Zero Trust. Hopefully our
you.
viewers got something out of it.
Thank you.
Because it is a
you.
complex issue, as we found out. It's not a simple answer.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but thank you. I want to, as a reminder that this recording for this webinar will be available later today on the Salt Lake Chambers website. And with that, I want to wish everybody a good day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Derek. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
See ya.